Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Seventh night of Hanukkah. I hope everybody is doing well and enjoying the latkes and sufganiyot and whatever else. And please God, the light at the end of the tunnel, as we say, Hanukkah should mark the beginning of the end of the terrible pandemic that we're all experiencing in one way or another, and look forward to Malim B'Kodesh, good things, hear good things. But this evening we're going to look ahead to post-Hanukkah in Parshat Miketz, which is normally, this is actually, Dr. Sokolow, I don't know the last time we read the Haftarah for Parshat Miketz, because it's like, I don't remember the last time that Parshat Vayeshev was, Shabbos Hanukkah. So I'll let you take that away, and we'll do the Haftarah for Miketz.
Yeah, well, it's one of the vagaries of the calendar, along with the fact that I am actually, as of the day that just passed, only about 21 years old. I was born on Lamed Kislev, of which there have been only about 21 in my lifetime.
Okay.
So, that's my birth certificate says. Doesn't say, the sixth night of Hanukkah, sixth day of Hanukkah. Doesn't say, it says, Lamed Kislev, and only get about, 7 of those in a 19-year cycle. So anyway, okay. There are other vagaries of the Jewish calendar. For example, only just about 10 days ago, we started saying V'tein talum atar livracha. And the question is, if you look in every Siddur, certainly every American Siddur, and probably every Siddur that's been printed since the beginning of the 20th century, it says that V'tein talum atar livracha is recited beginning on the evening preceding the 5th day of December, which of course calls to question, when did the 5th day of December become a milestone in halacha? Certainly, if you go back to the Mishnah and the Talmud, you won't find any references to the month of December. In fact, if you go back to the discussion in the Gemara, in Masachet Tanit and elsewhere about when do we begin reciting the prayer for rain, it says that in the land of Israel, they actually should have started reciting the prayer for rain the same day on which we begin to acknowledge God as the master of rain. That would be on Shmini Atzeret. The same day on which we start saying Mashiv HaRuach Morid HaGeshem, we should be saying V'tein talum atar livracha. Except that the rabbis were such firm believers in the positive power of prayer that they were afraid that the moment that the Jewish people started praying for rain, God would listen to them and it would start raining, and it would discourage people from going to Jerusalem on the pilgrimage. So they decided that instead of starting the prayer for rain on the last day of Sukkot, they would wait a couple of weeks. So in the land of Israel, they start the prayer for rain on the 7th day of the month of Cheshvan. Then the Jews in Babylonia wrote them saying, well, what about us here? And the rabbi said that since your climatic conditions are so different from those of the land of Israel, then you don't start praying for rain when they do. You start praying for rain 60 days after the autumnal equinox, which the Talmud calls the Tekufah. Okay? So theoretically, the autumnal equinox is the 21st day of September. So if you count 60 days from the 21st of September, we should be starting the prayer for rain somewhere around Thanksgiving. Instead, we don't start the prayer for rain until the evening preceding the 5th day of December, which is about 10 days, 12 days later. So how, in fact, did the 5th of December become the milestone in Jewish law? And the answer is that it's the result of a decision, a legal decision, what we would call a psak halacha, that was issued at the very end of the 16th century by the person who was considered at that time to be the leading religious legal authority in the world. And that, of course, would be Pope Gregory IX, who made the fateful decision in October of 1582 to remove 10 days from the calendar. Now, he could do it. He just had the papal authority. So he decided that the day following the 10th of Friday, the 10th of October, 1582, instead of being the 11th of October, he just simply took 10 days out of circulation. The thing is that Jewish people had paid no attention to Pope Gregory. So we continue to use the Julian calendar, which means that the 21st of September, which is the autumnal equinox on the Gregorian calendar, is actually, according to the Julian calendar, almost 2 weeks later. Right? It's not the 21st of September, it's actually the 4th of October. And that's why if you start counting 60 days from the 4th of October instead of from the 21st of September, you end up starting the prayer for rain on the evening before the 5th of December rather than around Thanksgiving time. Anyhow, so just you gave me an opening to say a little something about the vagaries of the Jewish calendar. And with that, if I have the screen.
You should. Your co-host, you can share the screen.
Okay. So let me just get back in here and share the screen with you all, and we will move into the Haftarah. Okay, so you can see very clearly with the text that's underlined in green why this Haftarah was chosen to accompany the Haftarat Miketz. The Haftarat Miketz begins with Pharaoh's dream, and at a significant point, it says, Vayikatz Paro, that Pharaoh awoke, v'hinei, and behold, chalom. The word hinei is generally used in Tanakh to introduce something that comes somewhat of a surprise. Right? May, for example, remember that just from a couple of weeks ago, that Father Jacob thought that he was marrying cousin Rachel, but Uncle Laban did the old switcheroo on him, right? And he went to bed that night with who he thought was Rachel. And then it says, Vayehi baboker, that when he awoke in the morning, v'hinei hi le'ah. And there clearly the word hinei is introducing something that certainly to Jacob came as a surprise, okay? Wasn't a surprise to us, right? Because we were able to read the verses in between, but Jacob probably didn't have his Bible with him. He probably wasn't staying in a hotel, didn't have a Gideon Bible, so he didn't know that Laban had switched sisters on him. In any event, Vayikatz Paro v'hinei chalom, Pharaoh awakens, and he's surprised to discover that what appears to have been so realistic to him, right, was actually a dream, okay? And here we see that the verse that you see underlined in the 3rd chapter of the 1st book of Kings says in virtually identical fashion, Vayikatz Shlomo v'hinei chalom, that Solomon too awoke, and behold, what was so realistic to him turned out to have been a dream. So we have to take a moment and step backwards into the book of Malachim in order to see just what Solomon dreamt of. So forgive me for a moment, and we're going to go backwards into the beginning of the 3rd chapter of the first book of Kings, and see just what Solomon's dream was, okay? Not only to satisfy our curiosity, but in order to understand the continuation of the story after he awakens, we have to know just what he dreamt of. So we see that the king went to the city of Givaon. Givaon was the site in which the Mishkan was situated, okay? It hadn't yet been moved, replaced with the temple in Jerusalem, because Solomon was still in his early years and as king, the very beginning of his rule, and he hadn't yet built the temple. So he goes to Givaon in order to offer a sacrifice there, because there was the Bama Gedolah, that is, there was whatever was stood in lieu of the Mizbeach, okay? And we're told that Elef Olot Ya'aleh Shlomo al HaMizbeach Hahu, and that he offered 1,000 korbanot olah, 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar, okay? And here it says, Givaon, there in Givaon, which is to the north, slightly to the northwest of Jerusalem of today, okay? Nir'ah Hashem el Shalomo b'chalom halayla, that God did appear to Solomon in a dream. Vayomer Elohim, and God says to Solomon in his dream, Sha'al ma eten lach. It's almost as though he had rubbed a lamp, right? And the genie popped out and said, what is your wish? Right? God says to King Solomon, ask, right? And I will grant your wish. And Solomon goes back a little bit in time. He lists a little bit of his yichus. He reminds God of the favors that God had granted to his father David, okay? And how David had gone before God be'emet, faithfully, ubitzdaka, righteously, uviyishrat leiv, and was a straight shooter, so to speak, okay? And then he says to him in verse 7, right? Ve'ata, and now, right? Hashem Elohai, the Lord my God, okay? You hatahim lachtat avdecha tachat aviravi, you have given me the opportunity to rule in the stead of my late father. Va'anochi na'ar katon, however, says Solomon of himself, right? Self-deprecatingly, but truthfully, right? He says that I am but a child. Lo edat set vavo. Literally, it means I don't know how to go out or come in. Parenthetically, right, as long as we're in the spirit of Hanukkah and the spirit of good humor, right? You remember, of course, that P.T. Barnum used to put up a sign which said 25 cents to see the egress, right? And people didn't know what kind of an animal an egress was, so they paid 25 cents. And they went into one side of the tent and there was a sign pointing to the egress. And what it did is that it led them to the exit from the tent on the other side. Okay, so when it says, Solomon says literally, I don't know where to go in and where to come out. I don't know the access or the egress. It's not exactly what it means. The term latzeit v'lavo is a technical term that's used to describe leadership in general, but a particular aspect of leadership in particular. You may recall at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses is handing over the reins of the Jewish people, so to speak, to Joshua. Moses said, "B'me'av esrim shana anochi hayom," right? I'm 120 years old today. Lo uchal od latzeit v'lavo. Literally, again, I am no longer able to go out or come in. But you also remember that the very end, the next to the last verse of the book of Devarim, describes Moses as lo chahata eno v'lo nas lecho. That Moses, in spite of being 120 years old, his eyesight had not dimmed, neither had his vigor. So when Moses says, I cannot go and I cannot come, he was not describing a physical incapacity. Rather, he was saying, I can no longer meet the responsibilities of leadership, because the leader is the one who went before the people, right, when they traveled or when they went out to battle, and he's the one who would then lead them back again at the end. Therefore, when Solomon says to God, I am young and I do not know how to go and how to come, he means that he simply has no experience in leadership. Okay, so going on now to the verse 9, and you see the underlining in yellow. His request that he makes of God is, V'natata l'avdecha leiv shomera, may you give your servant an open heart, a listening heart, lishpot et amacha, to be able to judge the people of Israel, lahavin ben tov l'ra, and to be able to make the necessary distinctions between good and bad. Ki mi yuchal lishpot et amacha hakaved hazeh, the very same words that we heard earlier in the book of Shemot from Moses, right? Talking to his father-in-law Jethro and describing the tremendous burden that he felt as the person who was ultimately responsible for for administering justice to the people of Israel. And then we're told in verse 10, Vayitav hadavar b'nei Hashem, that God was pleased with Solomon's answer. Kisha'al Shlomo et hadavar hazeh, that indeed of all of the things that he could have asked for, he asked for wisdom. And therefore God says to him in verse 11, that since he asked for wisdom and did not ask for longevity and did not ask for wealth and did not ask for military success, but rather he asked for an understanding heart in order to be able to administer justice, God says to him that I will give you what you asked for. And then as a bonus, I'm going to also grant you those things that you could have asked for but didn't. So you will also have wealth, and you will also have respect, and you will also have longevity. Okay, so this was the dream that Solomon had in Gibeon. And this is where the Haftarah begins, as I pointed out, exactly where you would expect it to begin in order to highlight or to accentuate its affinity to this week's Torah reading. It begins with Solomon awakening from his dream, okay? And since he had the dream when he was in Gibeon, he now returns to Jerusalem, where he stands in front of the Ark of the Covenant and once again offers sacrifices. And here we go in verse 16 into one of perhaps the best known anecdotes in the Bible, and perhaps one of the, not only from the perspective of Jewish education, but probably from the perspective of Sunday school education as well. Az tavona shutayim nashim zonot el hamelach vata'amod la lefanav. And then 2 women come before the king and they stand before him. They stand before him not because the king expects people to stand in his presence, because after all, what's the fun in being king if people don't stand in your presence? But it means that they station themselves before him. And there is a clear implication here that vata'amodna doesn't only mean that their posture was that they were standing upright, but it means that they stood before him seeking judgment. Okay? Amida bidin la'amod bidin, to stand in judgment, is a technical term. You see the little red mark next to the word zonot. You see that in English it's translated as harlots, but I want to point out that that isn't the only way in which to understand that word. In fact, I brought down the venerable Aramaic Targum, who renders shtayim nashim zonot as tartain nishin pundakan, 2 women innkeepers. A pundak is an inn, a place of lodging, okay? And in fact, the same thing can be said of yet another woman who is described in the Bible as a zonah, and that is Rachav, the woman who, in Jericho, who sheltered Joshua's spies, okay? It says of her too, that the 2 spies came to Beit Isha Zonah, to the house of a Zonah woman named Rachav. And there too, as you see, the Aramaic Targum renders it as Itisa Pundikisa, a woman who maintained a lodging, an innkeeper, okay? And I added again from later in that same chapter in Joshua, the description of how she threw a red rope out her window and enabled the spies to climb down the rope and to flee, because it says kiveitah bekir hachoma, because her house was situated in the wall of the city, uvachoma hi yoshavet, and stands to reason. I mean, who wants to live in the wall of the city? It's not a place. It's not certainly the ideal real estate to live in the wall of a city. But if it's not really a home, a private home, as much as it is a hotel, right, then that's the ideal place for the hotel to be situated. So the 2 women who come before King Solomon may very well have been what is the politically correct term? Women of the night, women of the oldest profession. We can stick to the English translation.
Sex workers.
May well have been. They may
Sex workers.
May well have been harlots. May well have been harlots. But it's also conceivable that they were simply women who ran a hostel. And you know the story, but we'll just go through it quickly. You can see that I underlined some of the text in orange and some of the text in blue. Okay, these represent the critical excerpts from the presentations that are made to King Solomon by the two women. So starting in verse 17, Vatomer ha'isha achat, right? One of the women, or if you wish, woman number one, says, right, to King Solomon, she explains to him that I myself and this other woman, okay, live together in the same house, and we both gave birth to children in a reasonably proximal time, okay? And she emphasizes, Ein zar itanu babayit, there is no one else, right, living in the house. Zulati shtayim anachnu babayit, only the two of us, okay? And here come the details in verses 19 and 20. In verse 19, right, the child belonging to the other woman, okay, died during the night, not crib death, right, but rather asher shacheva alav, that somehow the woman in sleep turned over and smothered her child, okay? But what did she then do? She got up, this other woman, the second woman, Vatakom betoch halayla, she rose while it was still nighttime. Vatikachet b'ni me'etzli, and she took my child from where my child was lying next to me, okay? And she replaced my living child with her dead child. So in verse 21, I arose in the morning in order to nurse my son and see that my son is dead. And you see the underline, ve'et bonen elav baboker. I looked at him carefully as the day grew light. V'hinei lo haya b'ni asher yaladati. And all of a sudden I realized that it's not my child. It's not the child I gave birth to. Okay. Now, woman number two gets to make her presentation before the king. And she says, no way. Ki b'nei hachai, the living child is mine. V'nei chamet, your child died, right? Vizot, and the first woman again reiterates her position, and she says, lo, that's not true. Ki b'nei chamet, your child is the dead one. Uvni hachai, and my child is alive, okay? Vatdaberna lifnei hamelech, and this is how they spoke in the presence of King Solomon, okay? So first thing that King Solomon does is that he simply reiterates in public, because we're presuming that these are not the only people in the room. The king is there, there's part of the king's entourage that's present, must be always a court reporter present, okay? In order to record the details of the case and particularly the verdict. So the first thing that King Solomon does is that he reiterates the claims of both parties. Vayomer HaMelech, Zot Omeret, one of these two women maintains, Zebni Hachai Uvnei Chamet, right, that the living child is mine and yours is the dead one. Vizot, and the other one Omeret, no, Ki b'nei chamet, your child is the dead one. Uvni hachai, mine is the living one. Very interesting to see. You see the little purple marking on the side, and you see the source towards the bottom of the page. That on this basis, Maimonides, in the rules of Sanhedrin, in the rules of administering justice, stipulates as a halacha, as a rule, that the judge must not only hear the arguments of the litigants, but lishnot ta'anotehen, that he must repeat their arguments, their claims. Shene'emar, in his proof text, is the verse in our Haftarah, Vayomer HaMelech, Zot Omeret B'nei HaChai Uvnei Hamet. The citation here illustrating how King Solomon, before he rendered a verdict, began by reiterating or restating the claims of the two litigants. Okay. Then Maimonides adds general advice to the judge, Matzdik et hadin belibo. He should consider the case himself, right? Belibo, think about it. V'achar kachotcho, and only after he has paused to reflect on the matter in his own mind should he then render a verdict. Okay. For those of you for whom you're coming across the story for the very first time, you're probably wondering how the king is ever going to decide who is the true mother. If you paid careful attention to the reading of the text, and I underlined the critical portions, then you might have already caught a whiff of what we will see later as the explanation of one of the parshanim, of one of the exegetes, as to how there is enough evidence here, there are enough clues in the Tanakh's rendition of the case to see where it's going. Okay, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is actually not that the king somehow played Sherlock Holmes and was able to come up with evidence, right? If that were the case today, it would be very simple, right? They do a DNA test on the child, they do a DNA test on each of the two mothers, right? And in a matter of, no time at all, they would have an absolute verdict, okay? So let's go on and let's see what King Solomon does next. Vayomer HaMelech, okay, after restating the positions of the two litigants, the king says as follows, Kechuli cherev, right? So obviously there's somebody else present, okay? And he says, bring me a sword. Vayaviu hacherev lifnei HaMelech, and sure enough, they come up with a sword. Vayomer HaMelech, and the king again speaks. So again, there are servants of the king present, ready to do his bidding. And the king gives them the following instruction. Gizru et hayeled hachai lishnayim. Cut the living child in two. Utnu et hachatzi le'achat. Give half of it to one of the women. V'tachatzi le'achat, and give the other half to the other woman. Whereupon in verse 26, Vatomer ha'isha asher bina hachai, the woman who was truly the mother of the living child, spoke up, and she said to the king, Ki nichmeru rachameha al bina, because of her compassion for her child, she said, Bi Adoni, please, your majesty, tnu lah et hayilud hachai, give the living child to the other woman. V'hamet al t'mituhu, just don't kill him. V'zot, and at the same time, the second woman was saying, Gam li, gam lach, lo yihiyeh. Much better. This is fair. This is equitable, right? Neither of us will have a living child. Gzoru, go ahead, cut the child in half. Now, if you haven't picked up on it yet, it should by now be 100% clear what the king is going to do. And indeed, he doesn't disappoint us. And in verse 27, the king says, Tnu lah et hayilud hachai, give the child to her, that is to say, to the woman who was prepared to give up the child, but to have its life spared. V'hamet lo t'mituhu, do not harm the child. He imo, this is clearly the child's mother. And now we finally get to the upshot of the whole story. What did it have to do with the dream? When all of Israel heard the verdict that the king issued, It says, Vayiru mipnei hamelech, that they were in awe or even in fear of the king. Ki ra'u ki chochmat Elohim bikirbo la'asot mishpat, because they saw that the king possessed divine wisdom, and that divine wisdom enabled him, la'asot mishpat, to make judicial rulings. It's almost as though they said, there's no way that he could have known, right, who the real mother was. Therefore, he must be a mind reader. And therefore, what were they afraid of? They were afraid that if the king had this ability, this paranormal ability, as it were, to read minds, and to be able to judge a person's guilt or innocence, as it were, just simply divining it, then nobody would be able to fool the king. And people who might in the past have gotten away with certain infractions, large or small, because there was no evidence of their guilt, were now in fear that they would be brought before the king, who would be able to establish their guilt even in the absence of evidence, because he would somehow contrive, right? He would come up with this ruse or this contrivance in order to be able to detect their guilt or innocence. And the concluding verse, which strangely enough is not verse 29 in chapter 3, but for reasons that have nothing to do with the Jewish tradition, because the division of the Bible into numerical chapters was not made by Jewish scholars, it was made by Christians. Somebody decided that this is where the chapter 3 should end, and therefore they made the next verse, the first verse in chapter 4, but the fact that it's incorporated into our Haftarah shows that it really belongs more to chapter 3. Vayihi hamelech Shlomo melech al kol Yisrael. That almost as though by this singular act of administering this judgment, Solomon was able to crystallize, to solidify his rule over all of Israel. Okay, lots of things to say about this, some obvious questions and some subtle questions. The obvious ones I've alluded to along the way. Is there really evidence from the arguments that the women presented that would already perhaps have tipped the balanced scales of justice in the favor of one or the other? What about Solomon's role in this? Can a judge really issue an instruction to execute a verdict? I'm sorry, the word execute there probably was a bit overreaching. To administer a verdict and then just as quickly withdraw it? So here are a bunch of sources, ancient, medieval, and for that matter, modern, that have grappled with one or another of these questions. Starting here with a general observation by the Bible commentary called Da'at Soferim, which was written, as you can see, in the middle to the late 20th century by the late Rabbi Chaim Dov Rabinowitz. And he says as follows: one of the most difficult things to confront in life, who pitron ta'alumot psha'im shena'asu lelo edim, is the resolution of crimes, or the riddle of crimes that were committed without being witnessed. Okay, al-kach, and it is with respect to such, that is to say, crimes that are not witnessed, that the Torah said, "Hanistarot l'Hashem Eloheinu," right? Mysteries, that is, the things for which there is no explicit evidence, right? We leave those to God to judge, okay? Ata, right? Now, through this incident, nitbarer, it became evident, she'en laha'alim mishlomo davar, that nothing could be hidden from King Solomon. Ume'ata, and from now on, gam choteim baseter pachadu mimenu, that even people who are guilty of crimes, but the crimes were committed in secret, that is, without being witnessed, and previously they felt that they were free, nobody was going to be able to judge them on it. Now they were in fear of him, b'chashasham, because they were suspicious, shetamid yimtza derech ketzad legalot et hara'a shene'esta, that he would somehow always find some sort of a ruse, some sort of a way in which to reveal that a crime had been committed. Here is the most interesting source I found. It consists of a she'ela utshuva, a halachic responsum. Somebody wrote a question to a very important rabbi who lived, he was exiled from Spain in 1492. Right? Interesting, must have been just about bar mitzvah at that time, and moved to the land of Israel and spent a considerable period of time as essentially the chief rabbi of Cairo in Egypt before returning to the land of Israel where he died. And his name was Rabbi David ben Shlomo ibn Zimra, and that's why he's known generally by his acronym as the Radbaz. And somebody in the early 16th century actually wrote him a question asking for his opinion of Solomon's judgment. And here's the question, right? We don't have the text, the original text of the question, but more often than not, the habit of the rabbis who answered the questions was to restate the question before answering it. Should I add parenthetically, perhaps following the advice of Maimonides to judges that before coming to a ruling and a verdict, they should begin by restating the positions of the litigants? Possibly. So, Sha'alta mimeni yedid nafshi. So apparently whoever asked the question is someone whom the Radbaz considered to be a good friend. I don't really know enough about him to know whether he could count his good friends on the fingers of one hand, or anybody who wrote him a question de facto became a good friend of his. But in any event, he says, you asked me al hamishpat sheshafat Shlomo ben shetei hanashim zonot. You asked me my opinion about Solomon's ruling in the case involving the two women. Dichtiv, right, vayishma ha'am et hamishpat asher shafat, which the conclusion was that when the people heard the verdict, right, they feared Solomon. And you asked me, ma chochma hayetera sheyesh b'mishpat hazeh? In what way was this judgment, was this verdict extraordinary? Ein ze kiyim tachbula min hatachbulot. It's essentially a subterfuge, a trick. V'yesh bizmanenu, and even in the 16th century, there are people sheyodea la'asot tachbulot ka'ela v'zulatam, who are capable of employing such subterfuges. Ve'ein lomar mipnei sheyatzat bat kol va'amra hi imo, lufichach yar'u mimenu. And don't tell me, the questioner says to Rabbi Ibn Zimra, don't give me the answer that it doesn't matter because eventually, according to the Talmud, a heavenly voice came out and confirmed Solomon's verdict, right, declaring that this woman indeed is the mother of the living child. And that's why people feared Solomon, because he had this divine confirmation of his judgment, right? Shaharei hakatuv meid, because scripture itself is very clear. And it says, K'mipnei hamishpat yaru mimenu, that they feared him because of his verdict, lo mipnei habat kol, not because there was heavenly confirmation of it. And here comes the answer. I didn't bring you the whole answer. It's much longer than just the paragraph that I've excerpted here. But first of all, you see how Rabbi Ibn Zimra did his homework, right? And that if he didn't already know what previous exegetes had written in their commentaries to the 3rd chapter of the 1st book of Kings, he certainly made it his business to look them up before writing his answer, because he refers his petitioner particularly to the commentary of Abrabanel. And it's particularly interesting because if you remember, Ibn Zimra himself, right, lived in the middle, let's say, of the 16th century. He was active in the middle of the 16th century. Abrabanel himself died in the first half of the 16th century. So it means that it wasn't a tremendous amount of time between the time that Abrabanel wrote his commentary and published it and the time that it was already being cited in this responsum of Rabbi Ibn Zimra. And it's probably because by the late 15th, early 16th century, there were already numerous Jewish publishing houses throughout Southern Europe and probably primarily throughout Southern Europe, Italy in particular. And therefore, it's reasonable to assume that that his acquaintance with the commentary of Abrabanel was through a printed book. In any event, he says to his petitioner that a lovely answer to the question was already provided by Abrabanel, and he has some issues with it, but essentially he cites Abrabanel's principal explanations of this event, and he says as follows. He says that there are 2 reasons. Second line of the Hebrew text, Mashenir Eli ki hamelech hekir et em hayeled mikama bechinot. That he says that even before this subterfuge of ordering the child to be cut in half, there were already at least 2 ways that he enumerates in which King Solomon might already have been able to determine which of the women was the true mother. Chada, first of all, he says, Shehikir partsuf hayeled hachai, domela partsuf haisha asher tova'at oto. He says, what's so hard to do? You look at the child, you look at the 2 women, and you see which of the 2 women the child resembles. By the way, just because it's going to come up later, he calls one of the women the tova'at. That would make her the plaintiff, okay? The other woman would be the nitba'at, and that would make her the defendant. In this case, the defendant is the woman who, at this moment when the trial began, had the living child in her possession. And therefore, the plaintiff was trying to get the child removed from her possession and restored to her, okay? So the woman who ends up being the true mother is the plaintiff in this case, and the woman whose child had really died is the defendant in this case, okay? And he says clearly, Partsuf hayeled hamet, the appearance of the dead child, domela partsuf hayisha asher biada hayeled achai, clearly resembled the defendant. So you don't need the trick, okay? V'od, and another possible reason he says, hikir et teva haisha hatova'at. Something not about the appearance of the 2 women, but something about their nature, the way in which they comported themselves. Shehi k'tzat hatnu'ah ziriza uzihira. He saw that the plaintiff was nimble, dexterous, and therefore it was unlikely that she had smothered her child in its sleep. But the defendant, hikir b'hefech zeh, thought that she was sluggish in her movements, that she was, I guess to use a technical term, klotzy, okay? V'shafat b'da'ato, and therefore he arrived at the conclusion on his own, ki hamed b'na shel zo, that she is the likelier one of the 2 to have smothered a child, obviously unwittingly, at night. So here we see, as I said, there's already some speculation, some lively speculation about it. And by the way, in terms of children or even infants resembling their parents, I remind you, right, because it wasn't all that long ago, the Sidrav Toledot begins by saying, Ela Toledot Yitzchak ben Avraham, right? These are the stories of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak, Abraham begat Isaac, right? Superfluous, redundant, unnecessary, okay? Says the Talmudic Agadah, because the wags of the day were saying that Isaac was born out of wedlock. Because Sarah and Abraham had lived together for decades and were childless. Masa Kadosh Baruch Hu, what did God do? Tsar klaster panav shel Yitzchak domeh la'Avraham. He fashioned Isaac's facial features so that they would resemble those of Abraham, ve'eidu hakol, so that everybody would be able to testify that Avraham holedet Yitzchak, that Isaac surely was the son of Abraham. So the idea that children, even infants, can be seen as resembling their parents is not entirely out of the realm of possibility. Another question that comes up in consideration of the story itself is the question of what's the motivation of the defendant, of the bogus mother, particularly her point at the end in which she seems to be saying, yeah, fine, that's okay, cut the child in half. Right? So the Metzudat David, which is a modern commentary, says as follows, lest her friend, right, the plaintiff, rejoice at the death of her son, the defendant's son, because it is unlikely that she wanted to nurse someone else's child. When she heard the king order the child's death, she, the defendant, was quite pleased, because now, A, her companion, the plaintiff, would not rejoice because she wouldn't be left with a living child, but neither would she, the defendant, have to nurse another woman's child, because if the ruling was that, yeah, you're the mother, you have to keep the child, then she'd be responsible for the child. Okay, she probably was already looking down the road and figuring out how much, Harvard tuition was going to cost. And now there was a relief, because if the child was going to be slain, then at least, she had already lost her real child. The only thing that she could see now in this new child was, a series of expenditures, okay? There's also a couple of interesting critiques of King Solomon. One appears in the Midrash on the book of Ecclesiastes in Kohelet Rabbah, in which there's a verse that says, Ilach eretz shamalkech na'ar, woe unto the country whose king is, well, na'ar in Yiddish is a fool, but in biblical Hebrew, it simply means a youth. Now, you remember that Solomon in his dream began by saying to God that the reason that he's requesting wisdom is because he's a youth, right? And he lacks the experience or the knowledge to be a leader. So this was taken as a description of King Solomon. At what point in his life? Obviously, at a point comparable to the one in our Haftarah, the point at which he makes this ruling. And Rabbi Yehuda says as follows, Ilu hayiti sham, if I had been there, right, in Solomon's court, I would have fastened a woolen scarf about his neck when he said, bring me a sword. And he didn't really mean that he was going to give him a red and green checked scarf because it was that time of year and he was giving him a New Year's gift, right? He meant that he would have tied the scarf about his neck and pulled it, okay? Why? Had he not been filled with compassion over him, he would have already been killed. And at that moment it was said, woe to the land whose king is youthful. So we find that at least one or some of the Tanaim, of the rabbinic scholars of the Mishnaic period, were not particularly swayed by Solomon's judgment. Another criticism shows up at a reasonably contemporary time. It shows up in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, where he relates this anecdote about King Solomon. When no one could devise what judgment could be given, and the whole court were blind in their understanding and could not tell how to find out this riddle, the king alone invented the following way how to discover it. He bade them bring both the dead and living child. He sent one of his guards and commanded him to fetch a sword and draw it, and to cut both the children into two pieces. Now, that's already a bit of a midrash on our text, that each of the women might have half of the living and half of the dead child. Now, that, of course, makes absolutely no sense, and therefore I'm not at all surprised that, according to Josephus, hereupon all the people privately laughed at the king as no more than a youth. But there again, you see, Solomon certainly does not escape without some sort of criticism. And the final source, leave it to our mid-19th century exegete Malbim, who actually did the Sherlock Holmes thing and came up with evidence on which Solomon might have been able to solve the case before he even got to employed the stratagem of cut the child in half. And he says, Scripture reports that when they spoke, the defendant said, right, go up to the first line of the text, lo, right, not so, b'ni hachai uvnech hamet. See the sequence? Vizot omeret, and the other one said, lo, b'nech hamet uvni hachai. So you notice, of course, that one of the women starts off with the living child, while the other starts off with the dead child. Says Malbim as follows. He says, Siper hakatuv ki bedabram, that by their speech, Amra hanitba'at, the defendant spoke of B'ni hachai uvnech hamet, V'hatova'at, the plaintiff said, Behefech, b'nech hamet uvni hachai. Now, Malbim says, Klal b'lashon. He maintains that there is a rhetorical rule, Sha'adam yakdim tamid, that a person always speaks first, Mashahu ha'ikar, about that which he believes to be most important, V'ya'acher, and he delays et hatafel, that which is non-essential. Therefore, he says, it was logical to assume that the woman who took care to place my son is alive first was the one who was intent on keeping her son alive, while the one who first said, your son is dead, was intent primarily on insisting that the dead child was her friend's, not on insisting that the live child was hers. And from this, Malbim says, Solomon could infer and decide who was the true mother. Well, there we go. Take a quick look at the chat. Yeah. I don't know. Do any commentators offer the possibility that the woman who lost her child was grieving her loss and could not bear the thought of seeing the other child spared, no less the thought of nursing and raising a child that was not her own? So as I said, yes, indeed, there was somebody who did indeed comment on that. So basically, you know, this doesn't require any great facility in Hebrew grammar or lexicography, doesn't require any specialized knowledge of Jewish law. This is really a very, kind of open and shut case in which, apart from the physical evidence, right, all you really have are whatever insights you can acquire or obtain, insights into human psychology based upon the way that people speak and the way that people act. Indeed, this is pretty much a rule throughout all of biblical literature. You know that the Bible, relative, let's say, to Greek literature, is very sparing in terms of providing details about people's physical appearance on the one hand, and details about their psychological motivations on the other hand. If you're really interested, I recommend to you the chapter called Odysseus's Scar, from a book called Mimesis, Mimesis. If I hadn't stopped to spell the title, I'd probably remember the name of the author. But there aren't many books, if any others, by that name. The book was written by a German Jewish scholar who escaped from Germany during the Holocaust and spent the duration of the war in Turkey, where he wrote this book. It's all about mimesis, the representations of art in literature, entirely from memory. He had no reference works to consult. Eric Auerbach, mimesis. Mimesis, the same root from the root of the word mime, right? To mimic, right? To mimic. Representations, I think reality, I said. Representations of reality in literature. And this entire chapter there, it's called Odysseus's Scar, where he compares biblical literature to Homeric literature. So rather than give it away to you, I'll give you an opportunity to read it on your own. But if we get to a point in a week or so where somebody has read it or not been unable to acquire it or to find it, and you really, really, really want to know what it says, so just remind me and I will do it. Somebody else, where I heard this is the subject of Yibum. There's the Talmud and the Midrash address this from a variety of strictly halachic perspectives. But as I said, I don't really think that the story needs that. And there we go.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, tomorrow morning, Professor Daniel Schwartz from Hebrew University will be giving a talk on Antiochus's decrees, Hersheyan Orthodoxy, and German Jewry on the eve of the Holocaust. And then I will be giving the Parsha Shir tomorrow evening on Haftarat Miketz. So we look forward to learning with you tomorrow, next week, in the future. Wish everybody well. A Shabbat Shalom. Of course, once we discuss the Haftarot, we can wish people a Shabbat Shalom, even though we hope to see you beforehand. And be well and be safe and enjoy the last couple days of Chanukah.